when you do this, because I'm always so used to having an extra piece of stuff out here. But anyway, I will. Oh, that actually is a good idea, Richard, because I can put my sheets over there. Yeah, good thinking. Okay. This is not my favorite talk always to do in some ways. It's maybe my favorite subject. Talking about soldiers in the First World War. I've got sort of a fixation about that. And some of you may know I'm writing a couple of books about the soldiers from here. My problem with it is that it is an emotional thing, and I am used to doing lots of joking around when I do my talks on other aspects of our history. And there's really not a whole lot to joke about here, at least not in the stories that I'm going to tell anyway. So bear with me. Today, by the way, is National Indigenous Veterans Day in Canada. And so I thought I would mention that we will be honoring the soldiers who lost their lives from Gravenhurst, West Gravenhurst, Morrison Township, Muskoka Township, and Ryde Township. We don't have any Indigenous soldiers who lost their lives from here, but we did have Indigenous soldiers, most of them from Rama, interestingly enough, who fought in the 122nd from here.
Any from Wata?
Wata, yes, but they're really connected to the Bala area, and so they they celebrate their heritage on Wata, and then it would be the people from Bala who would be talking about them more likely than here in Gravenhurst. Although I'm working on that. Actually, there's several soldiers who lost their lives from Wata. 100 years ago, the battles of the Great War were coming to an end. Fighting would stop on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of 1918. Each year I've talked about fallen soldiers of the Great War from Gravenhurst, and I will mention West Gravenhurst as a separate entity, even though for some of you, you may not know that, but it was a separate community, had its own post office and its own address and so on. Morrison Township, Muskoka Township, and Ryde Township, which are all part of the town of Gravenhurst now. This year I thought I would try to bring together the major Canadian battles of the First World War, the ones where we fought, along with the losses of the men from our town, shall we call it Gravenhurst, and add to it some of the major events that were happening at home, so that you've got kind of a context for all of this. Please remember that just as wars are started by presidents and kings and prime ministers and governments, the ends of wars are just as artificial. Declarations and treaties are made by men. They may stop the fighting, but they can't stop the effects of a war. So the Great War will not be over on the 11th day, the 11th hour of 1918. For some people, the nightmare may be just beginning at that moment. In Europe, we've got a number of things happening. In June, some strange Archduke, Franz Ferdinand is his name, and wife are assassinated in a country that most people have never even heard of. So that's happening out there and seems to be an excuse for some people to think about war. On the home front, we've got a declining prosperity in the country, and specifically in our town of Gravenhurst in the area. By 1912, the lumber industry is beginning to fail, and that's what had propelled Gravenhurst into its population of over 2,000 people on that earlier census. But now the population is dropping. Industry like logging and lumbering is all but folding. And the population of Gravenhurst in the 1901 census was 2146. In 1911, it had fallen to 1624. That's a huge drop. That's 24% of the population gone. And you know that it's mostly young men. We had 3 sanatoriums that were functioning at this point. The Cottage Sand, the Free Hospital, and the Minnewaska, which was operating at this point in preparation for the Calidor, which will be opened about 2 years later. Tourism, a flagging economy signals the beginning of a slowdown in tourism, and some steamships are no longer running at capacity because people just aren't spending their money on some of the kinds of things that we might call luxuries. bring into this situation recruitment for what's beginning to look an awful lot like a war coming. Yeah, exactly. Notice that that is not Uncle Sam in the center, but rather it is Lord Kitchener in the center of that poster, cajoling all Britons to join your country's army, knowing as he does, of course, although it wouldn't be long after this that he died, but knowing that in fact, all the colonies were largely populated by British subjects. Is your home worth fighting for? There's a message nobody could ignore. In August 1914, war begins to be a reality. On the 3rd of August, Great Britain declares war on Germany. Prime Minister Robert Borden, who's been holidaying at the Royal Muskoka Hotel, scurries home by a variety of means. He takes a ship. Actually, he doesn't take a ship. He takes a private yacht down to Gravenhurst, boards a train, and heads back home to declare war. And on the 4th of August, Canada declares war on Germany. Full-scale preparations are going to be set in motion for what will be a very short war. I mean, it's going to be over by Christmas, right? We know that. We know that. 4 months max. That's what everyone was told. Recruitment begins. Men begin signing up across Canada. And our two earliest soldiers to sign up, one is from Ryde, the very earliest man, and the second one is from Morrison. So Frank Carr comes all the way from Vancouver, takes the train all the way across the country. You can imagine the journey that would be, much to the chagrin of his family, by the way, his mother and sister, for whom he provides sustenance and whatnot. And William John Cook leaves Morrison and also heads for Quebec. Both of them are heading to Valcartier camp. A bunch of promises have been made at this particular time by the man who was in charge of war and munitions, have been made to England, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. But these are our two earliest soldiers. So that's Frank Carr on the left, that's from Ryde, and over there is William John Cook. He's the son of Henry Cook, for people who know the Cook family history. And he has come to Valcartier camp. That's what Valcartier looked like. It was literally being built on the fly. The moment war was declared, a piece of land was secured in Quebec, and immediately a camp was established. But you can see it's in a rudimentary form. Looks like organized chaos in the left-hand top picture. That's exactly what it was. It was a mud field within a matter of days. All these men arriving, and of course, horses as well, and to some degree, some wagons and whatnot. They would eventually erect a very nice little tent village there. As you see, they did some marching. They didn't do a lot of training with rifles because they didn't have them. So the training that they would have been with pieces of wood to substitute as rifles until they could get their paws on something a little bit more real. But this is literally being built on the run. Always ahead of us. Scene of mud and confusion. When war is declared by Canada, we have at this time a standing army of 3,100 men. Wow. And why not? I mean, we weren't expecting to be in a war. We weren't a country that was thinking that this is something we were going to need. We did have a militia, but it was really much more of a social club, I'd have to say. People met in the summertime. They had what you might call games, and really not war prep or training in any sort of way. But at least that many men, 59,000 of them, had heard the word military before. They just didn't know very much about it. But their leader, Sam Hughes, felt he knew all there needed to be known and could make as many promises as necessary. He was building his own particular little personal empire, we might say. So on the 10th of August, 1914, he promised England that we would send 25,000 men. Now, this is a pretty small country. We've got 7 million people at the time, okay? And most of them are in rural parts of the country. About 50% of the population is rural. He actually got 36,000 men who came in September to Valcartier to sign up. Now that is a heck of a surprise for everybody, including Sam Hughes, who discovers that in fact 5,000 of them are medically unfit and they're dismissed immediately and sent back home again. There could have probably been another 5,000 easily dismissed and sent home as well. Medical fitness of the kind that was needed was not necessarily rampant in Canada at that point. The first Canadian contingent basically assembled 31,000 men on the 3rd of October, and they set out on ships, and you can see the flotilla there, the largest flotilla ever to set out across the ocean. 31,000 troops and 31 ocean liners and a bunch of other smaller boats, as you can see, heading off to war. But good old Sam Hughes continues to make promises. On the 8th of July, 1915, so that's about less than a year later, he promises another 150,000 men from Canada. By the fall of that same year, he authorized another 250,000 men. And on the 12th of July, 1917, by an order in council, he was authorized to raise another 500,000 men. Now we're talking about a country that is relying on its young men for food and for production and for all of the things that you would rely on in a country for its growth and the health and safety. And we're going to be sending over, by the looks of it, one heck of a lot of men. At the top of each of these slides, you've probably noticed that there's a blue box and it says timeline, World War I, and then has some dates on it. That's really just to keep us sort of grounded in figuring out where we are in terms of the war. So between January and May 25th, 1915, we're really going to be talking about what would be classified as Second Ypres, but what would in fact be the first time that Canadians faced the enemy. The PPCLI, which is the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, had its own method of transportation. They didn't have to go to Valcartier to sign up, and they didn't have to wait for transportation on the Olympia or whatever to get to Europe. They had their own transportation because they were funded by Princess Patricia. So they ended up landing in France in December of 1914. But all the rest of these soldiers from Canada, the 1st Canadian Division first, arrives in France in April 1915. Now they'd actually arrived in Canada earlier than that, but they took about 4, maybe 5 months of training, a lot of it on the Salisbury Plain, if people know England, to get their feet under them and figure out how to do a number of the things that need to be done by soldiers. The Salisbury Plain turned very quickly into a mud bath, and that was perfect because that's exactly what they were going to face over the next 4 years. Second Ypres, between April the 22nd and May 25th of 1915, saw something that no one had anticipated, and that was gas attacks. The Germans unleashed gas, and you can see it down here in this bottom left photograph. That's canisters being opened with the wind at their backs so that they wait until the wind is in the right direction, obviously, and then they take those lids off those canisters. You sort of have them on a bit of an angle, and you send those gas fumes heading out into the field, the enemy. The first gas attack really went over the Canadians. The Canadians were actually in the field, and they had the French on their left, and the gas hit the French soldiers from France. They started to, nobody knew what it was. It's this green, smoky, gassy stuff that's coming over them. And only the officers really had any idea of what it could be, because nobody really had done much of any of this kind of biological warfare before. And so the French took the brunt of the first attack. Some of them died immediately or almost immediately, especially if they had a respiratory condition. Some of them, in fact, just got absolutely terrified. They couldn't see, they couldn't swallow, they couldn't do anything. And they either ran or fell or whatever. Then there's a gaping hole on the left-hand side. All these French troops have either gone down or gone back. And so the Canadians have to pick up that whole space over there and hold it. And they did.
Frank Card,
Car. Mhm,
he was killed on the 26th of April,
mhm.
but that was before Second Ypres. How,
No, the 26th of April is right smack dab in the middle of the second deep is April 22nd to May 25th. And he was killed right in the middle of it. He's the guy we saw as the very first soldier who signed up for the ride. He is the first one killed as well. Sad. Just a young fellow. He worked for the post office, actually. So there's first gas attack, and then there's a second gas attack. The Germans figure, wow, we did something really unfair. Let's do that again. And so they immediately outnumbered, outgunned, outflanked, and outgassed the soldiers, and the Canadians took the brunt of it this time. So what do you do if you're a Canadian unit and you're being gassed and you're kind of holding everybody's space over here because the French have fled? You counterattack. Absolutely unthinkable. The Germans would never have expected anyone under those conditions, fighting as they were, to breathe and do everything else, to counterattack. And they counterattacked because they were waiting for British reinforcements, and they were kind of hoping that if they counterattacked, they would keep the Germans busy enough that the British reinforcements would get to them.
Doesn't make sense too that if the gas is coming from where they are, they're not going to be in gas.
That's right. They're
You go
past
where
it.
gas is.
That's right. You go right past it. And yeah, and you head for them. And it worked. It was really well done. 6,000 Canadians were either killed or wounded in these days between the 22nd and the 25th, 22nd of April, 25th of May. I think a very sad thing to think that our very first boy who signed up is the first one to die. This is one of my favorite soldiers. I have several favorites, I have to admit, but this fellow I quite like. He was a student at Gravenhurst High School, and he graduated. He had been a member of the student militia. I was a member of student militia in my high school days in Arthur, Ontario, as we all were, everybody in the high school. Well, it wasn't a complete school thing, but it was a militia you could join, and he went off to Cobalt, Ontario after high school to become a prospector. He thought maybe that was where the lay of the land might be, since the logging industry was failing. When the 3 motor machine gun batteries were looking for men to staff their, that's a tank, everybody, on the left-hand side, to staff their tanks, where did they go and who did they look for to staff them? But they went to Cobalt, among other places, and Timmins, because they said to themselves, okay, we want men who've been in a mine, so they're used to confined spaces. Okay? That is going to be a confined space. We want men who maybe have a sense of adventure, because they've gone off to Cobalt, which is an unknown completely. And so, these might be the guys we need. And I think you'd have to have a sense of adventure to get into that thing right there and go onto the battlefield with it. Archie McEachran was on the move with his NCO, his non-commissioned officer, one night after one of these had been attacked and kind of blown apart by a shell. And what they were doing was, well, 3 of them went out from their unit. They were out looking for bits and pieces of the tank that they could sort of salvage. So they're scavenging for parts, shall we say. And as they're doing so, a sniper managed to shoot Archie McEachran in the ankle. Nothing too serious. He was picked up by the NCO and the other fellow with him, and after carried back to a casualty clearing station where he was treated immediately, then sent off to hospital, and then sent off to Calais in France, where a ship would take him to Blighty, as we would like to refer to England, whenever somebody had a wound that was just serious enough to get them out of France and into England. That was called Blighty. And boy, were you happy to have that happen, because it meant you were out of the immediate fighting and you were into somewhere civilized, warm, and not being shelled. So he boards a ship called the Anglia, which is a hospital ship. It's staffed by nurses and some doctors and so on, and some orderlies, and it's filled with wounded men. They're crossing the English Channel, heading for England, when in fact they strike a mine which had been laid the day before by the Germans in the English Channel. They strike a mine, the ship sinks in a matter of minutes. The nurses did a phenomenal job, and they got half of the people, half of those wounded guys off the ship and into the water where they could be picked up, because if they're in the English Channel, they're about halfway across. Obviously boats from England can then come and pick them up. But Archie was in the bottom of the ship. And so the men who were in the bottom were not saved. And so that ship is at the bottom of the English Channel still. And in fact, so is Archie. 22 years old. Just a baby. Meanwhile, back at home, recruiting for the 122nd Battalion that everybody hears about in Muskoka begins in earnest in late December. So it was very close to the end of December, very, very close to the end of 1915, when they begin under Colonel Grant, who was a lawyer from Huntsville, to set up a unit that would be a Muskoka unit. They start recruiting. They do marches like the one you're seeing here. This is Port Carling. And you can almost see in your mind, I think, where we are in Port Carling. You know, yeah, exactly. The swing bridge is right there. And you can, I think you can tell, I don't know where your eyes are, but those men stretch as far as the eye can see across, which makes it look like it's been very successful in recruiting. In actual fact, not quite so much. Recruiting centers were set up in Huntsville, that was Company A, in Bracebridge, Company B, in Gravenhurst, Company C, in Port Carling, Company D, with an additional office in Utterson. Plus, they did some recruiting all along the way. So these guys are on a trek. They're basically marching through Muskoka on a sort of around the district trek. And the women of each community would feed them at night, and they'd be housed in a local park and blah, blah, blah. And they were hoping to pick up soldiers to join them along the way. And of course, there was a band playing, and you can see the instruments there at the front. And in fact, that would be the kind of thing that might bring out some young men to come and join up. The 122nd is not like other units that you will have read about or maybe would like to read about. You saw those recruiting posters earlier that I showed you, and those ones made it very clear that if you signed up for the Great War, you were going to fight. That's what you were going to be doing. This makes it very clear that the 122nd isn't going to be doing that. They are in fact going to be doing what they've been doing and are kind of running out of jobs to do, and that is they are going to be in a forestry company. Now, my son, Mark, who's a First World War historian, in fact, that's his job, argued with me about this and said, I don't think anybody told them that they wouldn't be fighting. Well, there is a line in there somewhere that says that you might end up. But then there's another line that says it's an entirely separate force from the fighting units. So I don't think it could be much more crystal clear than that, that if you were joining the 122nd, you weren't planning on fighting, you were planning on cutting trees. And I love the part where they say, you have to pass the medical exam for a forestry company, which is a much less stringent examination than the one that would be administered to people going into the army or whatever. And then you've got the opportunity to take on regular work for a year or two. And you've got a trip to England, right? Good, this is good. And you'll have the time of your life when the war is over and peace is declared. There'll be parties everywhere. Imagine the fun you will have. And you'll be completely separated from any of those nasty fighting units.
companies and battalions.
Mhm.
What regiment did they belong to?
The Ontario Regiment, and I can't remember which number, but it was the Ontario Regiment.
So they're fighting opponents in their same regiment.
There could be, not necessarily, no, because they were actually organized as battalions. They were recruited as battalions, not really as regiments. They were recruited as battalions. And so the objective for Colonel Grant was to recruit 1,000 men from Muskoka to form the 122nd Battalion. In actual fact, he can't get that many. He gets 600, and then a few more people sort of encouraged to join, and he gets kind of closer to 800. But eventually they'll have to top that up with men from other places. This is the band, whoopsie daisy, come back here, you. This is the band that would become the foundation for the military band of the 122nd. And they're standing right beside the Opera House because that is the citizens band from Gravenhurst. Now, in that group are some of the men from Rama who actually played in the citizens band in Gravenhurst and then played in the military band that would become the band for the 122nd.
They go overseas?
Yes, they did. They did.
No,
No, every battalion had the objective of having a band. It was considered to be important to have a band with your battalion unit. And you know that if it was actually a Scots regiment, you're going to be sending them in kilts, and you're going to have a piper piping them in the battle, right? So music was important. And there's Company C from Gravenhurst outside the Opera House, March of 1916, I'm guessing. There's a little bit of snow still there. The Opera House at this point is 15 years old. Roof is actually starting to look a little seedy. But there's the majority of the guys who are going to comprise the Gravenhurst Company C. More musicians, by the way, were added from other communities to the 122nd band before they went overseas, but we formed the nucleus with our local band. You'll notice that back here and at home, along with recruiting and so on, women are also striving to get the vote. And they're doing so for a couple of reasons. Women, on the one hand, particularly women who are fairly strong. Whoopsie daisy, come back here. We're talking about, whoops, set down my, change size. Women wanted to vote for obvious reasons. I mean, you do want to be able to vote and decide the future of your area, your country, and so on. But they particularly wanted the vote so that they could vote for what was going to be coming for sure in everybody's mind, conscription. Because if you had a son or a husband or a brother who was over there fighting, and then there were all these men who weren't over there fighting, you wanted to send a bunch of men over there so that your son was not going to be alone eventually on the battlefield. And as recruitment started to fall off, began to feel a little like they could be. So the vote would become instrumental in a very short time. We were neither the first nor the last province to give the vote to women, but we certainly didn't shine. It was a while coming, 4 months. Oh no, more than that, a year and 4 months into the battle to get the vote for women, but eventually it did finally come. And you'll see over there on the left hand or on the right hand side that Canadian mother who's saying, "I'm going to be voting for the Union government, and I won't stand by and see you alone on the battlefield." And we'll make sure some conscripts over there. But in battle. It's the 2nd of June, 1916, and we're looking at the Battle of Montserrat, which is in the Ypres salient. You know that a salient is a place where there's a bulge in the line. So if in fact you've got kind of a relatively straight line of front line soldiers, sometimes they take a little more land in one spot than in another, and a little bulge kind of occurs. And the Ypres salient was right in the middle of the front lines, and it went out into the German territory a little bit, and that was called the Ypres salient. And at the Battle of Mount Sorel, we lost our youngest soldier. Now, Herbert White looks like such a sweetheart. I have several other pictures of him. The little girl beside him is his little sister. And she looks to be about 2.5 or 3. And apparently she spent most of her time trying to hold on to his leg. That was just her sort of thing. She loved her big brother very much. He didn't sign up in Gravenhurst, smart boy that he was. This is true of a number of guys. Instead, he went to Niagara Camp, which was in Niagara on the lake, to sign up because there was nobody there who knew him. He attested that he had been born in 1896, and therefore he would be almost 20. And he's certainly a tall boy. He's almost 6 feet tall. In actual fact, had he signed up in Gravenhurst, Dr. McClay, who would have done his medical, would have said, I know how old you are. I delivered you, for heaven's sakes. And it was not in 1896. In fact, you were 14 years old. Can you imagine? And he signed up at that age and was just 15 when he was killed in action at Mount Sorel. I can't think of him with anything but sadness because he reminds me of boys I taught in high school who thought they knew what maybe they were going to be getting into. And then it's a completely different thing than anything they could ever have imagined. And that's him for sure. On that same day at Mount Sorel, we also lost Herbert Thomas Stamp. The name Stamp is familiar to some people, I'm sure. Gravenhurst, he also was killed on the same day. And a little bit later on, we lost a guy named Clarence Lauren Adamson, who also came from Gravenhurst. We lost him at Hill 60, which was also in Deep Salient. He was only 19 years old. A lot of young men. Mount Sorel was really not much of a mountain, by the way. You have to take the word Mont in France and in Belgium with a bit of a grain of salt. We're actually talking about pimple or tiny hill, just basically about, a little bulge in the landscape. They're not really mountainous, to say the least.
Yeah, how much young men at this time in the war knew about what was going on in France and what conditions were like. Surely there must have been some people who were coming back.
They were starting to. Yeah, they were starting to. Not a lot. If you look at the great papers, and Barry, I think you probably looked at some of the ones from the First War. 1916, there's not a lot of mention made of the war. There's not a lot of talk about it. The Toronto Star, if you were living in the city, might have had something there, much more, or Telegram. Ottawa city newspapers would have had more stories about the war and what people were coming back and saying. But it's interesting to look at the letters written by young soldiers when they were heading out, because they write these really optimistic letters. They're oh my goodness, they're so full of gung ho. They're just going to go over there and they're going to do this and they're going to do that. And the journey was wonderful and I'm doing this and so on. 2 letters sort of max. And then there aren't any more letters, because in too many cases they had an experience before writing the next letter that didn't really lend itself to a letter to mom. And so in fact, I got some letters that we've got in the archives that came from one soldier whom we'll meet a little later on. And he sends a letter to his father and says, don't show this letter to mom. I don't want her to know. How terrified I am is one of the parts of it, and how bad it is, how bad it really is. So to answer your question, Richard, they didn't know nearly enough.
When the letter arrives, the bottom of that, or reading it, or somebody's reading it out loud.
I would bet you anything. Yeah, well, you'd wonder. I think that in the case of this fellow I'm talking about, and as I say, we'll meet him a little bit later. His name is Hilton Miller. They had a farm where the old Muskoka golf course used to be. It's a farm that the Miller farm was there for a long time. And it was the old Muskoka golf course. And then it the land went right down to the water, so they even had cabins on the water. I suspect that Dad maybe was able to get to the mailbox each day and get the mail, you know?
But would he know if the letter was?
I bet-
Information.
I bet that he proofread first, because these two letters that I'm talking about ended up being stuffed into his daily ledger for his business. And I'm opening up a ledger expecting to see, you know, a list of all the things that have been purchased. And in fact, there's 2 letters from a soldier in there that I already know about, and that I just sort of, oh my gosh, and couldn't believe that that's what I had come upon. This set of pictures is for all of those who went to high school or university and studied British history and know about that whole business of the thin red line. On the top left over there, you've got the thin red line that would have been used, say, in the 1700s or in the War of 1812. Bottom left, you've got the thin red line as it would have appeared in much the same time period. And you've got the Crimean War in the center, another thin red line. Do you notice that they're all shoulder to shoulder and closer than yeah, 2 lovers on the field?
Enemy fighter could hardly fail to hit.
Hardly fail to hit somebody, absolutely. Douglas Haig, Sir Douglas Haig, is, I think, justly reviled because his orders on the 1st of July, 1916 to British soldiers, which included Canadians, they were ordered to go over the top and advance shoulder to shoulder at a walking pace. They were not to fire until they got within 20 yards of the enemy.
Century to
Yeah. What?
Several.
What was it? You know, and you can imagine, I mean, they just mowed them down like cornfield. Yeah, and there they are going over the top and so on. And then they were supposed to line up and, you know, go across. Awful, awful thing. Yeah. The theory was that 7 days of constant 24-hour shelling in the Somme would actually pretty much do in the Germans. They believed that between the 23rd and the 3rd of June, 1916, if they lobbed 1.5 million shells at the Germans, that in fact you would completely wipe them out. You would wipe out their trenches, you would wipe out the men, and in actual fact, most of the Germans survived the shelling, although some of them were driven mad by the sheer overwhelming nature of that kind of bombardment. So there they are, the British ordered to advance on the German lines at a walking pace, shoulder to shoulder, and they get close enough, the Germans would open up from the shelter of their trenches and mow them down.
And Haig was not removed for it or anything.
No, he wasn't, and he wasn't really well loved by the men on the field. It is the worst day of carnage in British military history to that time. The Somme offensive would continue for another 4.5 months. Morrison Township lost its first son, John Allen Reman, not to the stupidity of generals and not to the marksmanship of German snipers, but in fact to the careless handling of a firearm in the hands of a young frightened soldier. They were ordered before the next attack that they were going to undertake to clean their rifles. And you know what you do first? You empty your rifle before you start cleaning. Well, in fact, just behind him, he's standing with his back to some other guys down the trench, and in front of him are some of his friends, and they're all cleaning their rifles. And behind him, another young man about the same age is starting to clean his rifle when in fact it fires and shoots him dead. He's shot in the head. I can't imagine what a mother would feel like to have already dreaded the fact that her son had gone off to war, only to learn that he had been killed by friendly fire. I just can't even deal with that at all. It would be beyond me. John Reman is buried actually in Europe. I have burial for every one of them, for every soldier, all 584 of our men who went. So yeah, we know where they are.
Missing, in other words.
Some of them did, yeah, and they're on the, but we know where they were, and we have them on the memorials in Europe, you know, the Meningate or whatever. Meanwhile, back home, it's nice to know that it's business as usual. In case you wondered how the folks back home were doing at this point, well, some of them were trying to turn a profit from war. This should not be a surprise to anyone. Although the reality that Richard was asking about is starting to sink in a bit, because at least a dozen and then 30 more soldiers have been sent to Gravenhurst to go to the Calidore Sanatorium and the Free Hospital because they have got trench lung from inhaling poison gas, or they have got tuberculosis contracted in the trenches. And so the Calidore Hospital has been extended to take these men in. It's starting to get around a little bit, at least, that these guys are coming back and they are just totally a mess. Some of the guys from the sanatoriums would try to go out and get a drink because, of course, no alcohol was being served in the sanatoriums. So they would sneak off if they could, and they would make that long trek from out where the sands all were into town to the Albion or to the railway restaurant, which was in the railway station. As such, it was not much of a station because we hadn't yet built the new train station, and the old train station had burned down in 1913. So in fact, we're talking sort of in between stations here, but there is a spot that they call the railway station where the train disembarked its people, and there was a place where they could get a drink there. Gosh, these barkeepers didn't know anything about the fact that they weren't supposed to be serving liquor to soldiers. What a surprise. Anyway, the whole Scott Act temperance thing didn't really have much bearing on Gravenhurst. Gravenhurst didn't really fully subscribe to the Scott Act. And so liquor was more easily obtained than you might think at a time when temperance was supposed to be running. But in fact, good to know that free enterprise was running full steam. We're back on the battlefield, and we're going to be talking again about the Somme for a bit. The Canadian divisions were moved up to the Somme almost totally at this point by August of 1916. They took over a section of the front lines in front of a village called Courcelette. We've mentioned Courcelette just before, I think, but they actually were given an objective, and they met that objective, a village of Courcelette. They took over as a German stronghold and managed to win that battle. The Somme offensive was largely being waged across a battlefield that was pocked with these giant craters from all the artillery shelling. And so it was not only a sea of mud, but it was also pocked with these giant craters, some of which filled with water to the point of becoming a lake. They were deep, actually deep craters. Oh, they certainly did. And one of these, which was quite famous, was the Regina Trench. It took quite a lot of work to actually take the Regina Trench area from the Germans. And we lost several young men at this point in trying to take Regina Trench. One of them was, the first one was Alex Mortson, who was killed at Courcelette just before the Regina Trench battle. And then on the 26th of September, Corporal John Marshall. And then on the same day, St. Elmo Milliken, I love his name, Evan St. Elmo Milliken, I love it, came from Severn Bridge, was killed in the Regina Trench, and he was 27 years old. You notice the ages of these boys that we're talking about. They're probably older than some of you might have thought, because they, generally speaking, the average age of men in the Canadian Army is 26. So not sort of what we always think of as being the case. We always think of them as being so young.
Did you notice in the course of the war that the general average of age increased? Say that there were more teenagers at the beginning of the war and more men in their 20s later on, or
no, I think it would almost be the reverse of that to some degree, Richard, because I'm thinking of some of the fellows who came of age and could finally go without their parents' permission. And so I'm thinking of, for example, a young man who eventually does join the 127th 1/22, and he is 18 and X number of days. So he's hit his 18th birthday, and he's signed up because now he doesn't need mom and dad's permission to do so. So there's quite a mixture all the way through. Every time you see a notice from somebody's death here, you'll see an extreme variety of ages involved here. And yet another young man lost at Regina Trench, who was 24. He was from Gravenhurst. His brother, Arthur Cuff, who is mentioned in the newspaper clipping from the Banner, was actually a baggage handling man at the train station. And first he gets, it's how often mail came in these days. I don't think anybody can realize that you might get mail 3 times a day. So he gets a letter early in the day, and it says he's been wounded. He gets a letter at the end of the day saying he's dead. And it just feels as quick as that. We're going to flip our calendar page over, and we're heading for 1917. January and February 1917, I've sort of labeled the calm before the storm. The storm is going to be Vimy Ridge. So on January the 4th, 1917, a young man named Corporal John McGinnis is killed at Neuville-Saint-Vaast. He's 27 years old. But the one I wanted to focus on here for a moment is a guy named Alfred Cromwell Myers. He's very young. He's a corporal though, so he's smart, and he's, well, people always think that promotion is based on being smart. Not necessarily. I mean, men were falling like flies, quite literally. And so they had to keep replacing people in the battalion. Trench raids were something that all battalions and soldiers and groups of soldiers did. And so in the particular company that Corporal Alfred Cromwell Myers was in, maybe 10 fellows or so were assigned the job of a trench raid on a German trench. So they head out across no man's land, they get to the German trench, and they literally get there, and he's shot. He's shot, but not badly wounded. I don't think anyone felt. He sort of sat down abruptly and in this trench, but they can hear the Germans. The trench is of course curved. And so, you know, you could be standing here hearing the Germans talking, and they're way up there, but there's quite a curve in between, so they can't see each other. And he sits down and he says, look, the rest of you guys go on and do the trench raid, you know, finish it, get all the information you can, get prisoners if you can, blah, blah, blah. I'm just going to sit here until I get my breath back. And so I can feel sort of like I'm able to walk again. And then he heads back. He says he's going to head back to his line. Or if I'm still here, you can pick me up then. But when his men come back, they discover he's not there, and they think, oh, well, he's gone back to our guys. You know, that's where he is. And they ask up and down the line, everywhere, asking for him. Did anybody see? Did anybody see? Nobody saw. And eventually he was simply labeled as missing in action and then killed in action. But in actual fact, the Germans, as did the British, would send over messages saying, we've taken the following prisoners, if they could get, for instance, the information that those prisoners had about, you know, their names and number and so on. So they sent back a message saying that they had this guy, Alfred Cromwell Myers, a corporal, but that he had died of his wounds. And so they buried him in Mericourt Communal Cemetery, the German extension. And then that was the end of him. Nobody kind of knew anything more about him. So he's now on the Menin Gate. One of the wonderful things that has happened through the Commonwealth War Graves Commission is that as expansion takes place in Europe and in some of these areas, maybe buildings are being built and towns and cities expanding, there are in fact corpses unearthed. And this Mericourt Cemetery was going to have to be moved. They expected that it would be all German soldiers in that cemetery. That was what the report was. And so they were going to move them all to a cemetery, probably in Germany, I would think. Anyway, they began to exhume the people, the bodies in there, only to discover that one of them is wearing the uniform of a Canadian corporal. He has his shoulder flash still there. Obviously, There's not a lot of his uniform left there and not much of his body, but in actual fact, they are able to then do the elimination work of figuring out who were the corporals who were in battle that day. Where were they all? They were here. Okay, how many corporals were in this area? Blah, blah, blah. And they get it down to the fact that this unknown soldier is Alfred Cromwell Myers. In 2015, they got the word. John Myers, who is one of his cousins, lives in Halifax. And I have talked about this extensively because it was something of a celebration for them to find out where he was. And so the Commonwealth War Grave Commission then took his body away from all those other German soldiers that were over there and buried him again, but this time in a cemetery that is of his own men. He was 19 years old when he died. He's no longer an unknown soldier. He has a stone that says Alfred Cromwell Myers. And we're seeing these stories coming out more and more. Every year, there's at least one or two more of these men who are, in fact, the Myers family was very, very, very heavily involved in the First World War. There are all kinds of reasons for that. Three of the Myers family, at least, I think there's three of them here, had already moved to Saskatchewan because things just weren't looking up too promisingly in Gravenhurst. And so Alfred Cromwell Myers had gone with his family and with his cousin Burton Garnham Myers went with them, William Norman Myers, and as well, I think, no, maybe there's those guys, all went to Saskatchewan. Alfred Cromwell Myers had gotten a job as a school teacher out there. So those three guys were all out in Saskatchewan. All of them signed up for war. Burton Myers, who came back to Gravenhurst after the war, was wounded. The others were either in the 122nd or in the Canadian Field Artillery. And you can see the variety of ages. So these are brothers and cousins. Alfred Cromwell Myers wasn't the only one who might consider to be a sort of a hero, heroic figure. Milton Wells Myers was in fact much more so. He joined the 20th Battalion. Milton was only 5'3" inches tall, so he made it under the original sign-up criteria, which said you had to be at least 5'3". Eventually that moved up again, and then it moved back down again. But in actual fact, he was 5'3", and he made a perfect scout. You know, if you think about it, what did you want to be in trench warfare? Not tall, not tall. You want to be short because you're going to get picked off much more easily if you're tall. He was a scout, so he got the pleasant job of going out on trench, what might be called a personal trench raid, constantly looking for information and so on. Well, Milton Wells is out one night on one of these little excursions, and he comes across a German tent or trench, and he finds in that trench a man tied up who's an officer and who's wearing a French uniform. And he immediately realizes that this is a prisoner that the Germans have taken. They've sort of dumped him in this corner, tied up so he can't get away. And they're off doing probably a trench raid on our trenches. Anyway, he unties him, half drags him, half carries him back to our side. You can only imagine the French family when they find out that their son has been rescued, half carried, half dragged, because Milton's not very big. He gets him back and he saves his life. They, in fact, paid for an all expenses trip to Paris for him, because you did get a week of leave periodically. They paid for an all expenses trip to Paris for Milton Myers in order to reward him for this. And our government awarded him the military medal for rescuing this French officer. I think that's a neat story about him. He actually would also be a very good example of some of the other wounds that aren't so visible that happen to soldiers in a war like the Great War, where people eventually just can't take it anymore and turn to whatever it is to try to blot out the memories of where they've been and what they're doing. Now back home. the Royal Air Force had seen the results of using airplanes a little bit in Europe. The Germans did it, the British did it, to do reconnaissance over the battleground. And they could learn a heck of a lot from a plane flying over. So in fact, they began to think it might be a really good idea if they looked into all that empty space in Canada and set up a few airfields, made a few planes, and they got them from both Canadian companies and American companies. And they managed to, they managed to create a number of planes. They trained 9,200 cadets. They sent over, not less than half of them, overseas. They also graduated technicians and so on. A lot of them were killed in training accidents here in Canada, because you can only imagine those planes were iffy, to say the least. But it was the start of the first airmail service in Canada and in this war. So that actually is the start of our air age, really, in Canada. But we're going to let Bertie Robinson have the last word on the air age, because Bertie Robinson in Morrison lived on a farm down there. And one of the hired men on the farm, or maybe the only hired man on the farm other than her brother, was in fact her friend Jack Greenwood, a young man that I believe she hoped she would marry when he came home. So she wrote letters to him. And in the letter that you can see there, she talks about cars and planes and the things, the new things that are happening in Morrison Township. Uncle Von Sanderson has a car, and John Beatty has a car, and Abe Sofers, they've got a car. So these are becoming pretty common, she says. There's 3 of them right there, people you know who had cars. But airplanes are scarce. There was one that came over today and then went back again. And I'm guessing that that would have been from Camp Borden, which would have been probably the closest airfield to Morrison Township at the time. This has been the 3rd one now in a month that I've seen. I think I would like to go up in one. I think that, but maybe I would not want to after having gone up in one. So in actual fact, I mean, realistically speaking, she's probably quite right. Anyway, Bertie Robinson continued to write to Jack for a little bit longer past this, but she would receive all of Jack's effects, including her letters to him, notification from the Canadian military saying, regret inform you, which is the way they always began, a letter from his padre and another one from one of his friends who had seen him dead, all confirming that the man she had hoped to marry was dead. And she died 5 years later, and I always think maybe from a broken heart. About 18, I think, is how old she was, and then 5 years later when she died. Yeah, she's actually related to, I believe she's related to not just a friend of family of Nola Ibbotson, or Nola Ibbotson's mother, who came from Morrison Township, and certainly knew the Robinson family. Her brother, Bertie's brother, Gordon, was overseas as well. In one of the many lead-up battles to the storm that I've mentioned here, we have an opportunity to meet a young man whose name is Frederick Arthur Smith. And he comes from Morrison Lake. You, I think, will know where that is, just in Morrison Township, not too far south of Gravenhurst, really, but not all the way to Kilworthy. Am I right? You're before Kilworthy, eh? Yes, yeah. So we've got a picture of the farm that he lived on and so on. A very engaging soldier, I would think, because I can only imagine the commanding officer of the unit when he came and signed up. And it was, in fact, the 15th Battalion, who are the Royal Canadian Highlanders. What better unit? Anyway, he was almost 6 feet tall. He was a carpenter by trade. He had an education. And I think, you know, him walking into a recruitment center and saying, I want to sign up, there'd be people just running in all directions saying, come in, we're not letting you out. Yeah. During a raid on the enemy trenches in the Cologne section, this is the military medal he wins, okay? So there's always a citation when you win a military medal, telling what it was you did in order to receive this medal. So during a raid on enemy trenches on the 2nd of March 1917, this non-commissioned officer, NCO, was in charge of a party on the left flank. Though wounded in the leg while crossing no man's land, he continued to lead his men into the enemy trench. The example set to his men, half of whom had never been over a parapet before, and he's going over the top of the trench and out into the field, previously had a far-reaching effect. In addition to this, he led a bombing attack on a German post, which was putting up a stiff resistance, and carried on with his duties until fainting on being wounded a second time. No, I'm talking about Frederick Arthur Smith. Yeah. And of course, they say in that citation, his devotion to duty is particularly deserving of merit. In actual fact, it really was. And he died of his wounds later on that day and received the military medal. We've been working very hard to get acknowledgement of him. The people in town actually knew that he was wounded the first time. He was wounded back in 1916 as well. So this isn't the first time he's been wounded, gotten better, and come back to fight. And there's actually a notice in the Gravenhurst banner saying, Arthur Smith has been wounded, and blah, blah, blah. In 1916, he never appears on the monument. Somebody wasn't keeping track, I guess. Anyway, not only he, but a man named Alfred Bowers also died at roughly the same time at Arras. And he's from Severn Bridge. Yeah.
Was there just to give anybody just as I didn't see.
Yeah, no, it does say it actually above in his actual citation, in his file. It's in his actual file. It was a posthumous gift of a military medal, obviously, since he died from his wounds that day. It makes you realize how many raw recruits there were on any given day who'd never been over the top and who relied upon a non-commissioned officer, a corporal, a sergeant, mostly sergeants, to lead them over the top. And I have to say, it's interesting to go through the files of a number of these soldiers and discover that they are promoted to be corporal, and then they're promoted to be sergeant, a couple of battles. They relinquish their rank and they go back to being private. They do not want to lead any more men to their deaths. It's as simple as that. They simply couldn't bear the fact that when they had to get out there and stand at the edge of the parapet and say, okay, men, let's go forward, blah, blah, blah. No, they just couldn't do it anymore because they knew what was probably going to happen. So a lot of them just didn't really want to be in that position. Yes, to relinquish. Yeah.
Judy, is there a tribunal that determines type of medal?
Yeah. What would happen is his commanding officer, who would not be a non-commissioned officer, he would be an officer with a commission, maybe a major or higher, would in fact identify at the end of a particular battle, would identify anybody that they felt was deserving of a medal of some kind, and would maybe even specify probably a good candidate for a military medal. And you can see that at the bottom it says his devotion to duty is particularly deserving of merit. That's aimed at the people who are going to be making decisions about whether somebody's getting a military medal or not. And in fact, that would be sent up the line and all the way back to England. If he was going to get a military medal, it would be published in the Gazette, London Gazette. That continued into the Second World War. People who received medals or were mentioned in dispatches or whatever, it's recorded in the London Gazette, and that makes it official. Now we know he's got this medal and he's been given it. We've been talking about the lead up to the storm, the calm before the storm, and here's the storm itself. On the 9th of April, 1917, the Battle of Vimy Ridge. 4 Canadian divisions take Vimy Ridge near Arras in France. We lose one heck of a pile of men. Over 10,000 men are either killed or wounded. In 6 days, we lost, just from Gravenhurst, Morrison, etc. We lost 6 of our men, and you can see them there. And they're quite a variety of ages, but 27, 22, 27, 24, 19, 20, kind of all in that range that we would consider to be your typical age group, although they're slightly younger by average. We lost Sidney Thomas Mearing from Severn Bridge. We lost Garfield Russell from Gravenhurst, John James McKay, or JJ McKay as he was known, from Gravenhurst, Dennis Hartman Cox from Ryde. We lost Harold Muldrew from Gravenhurst and Hubert Corbett. And I'm going to talk about those last two fellows for a moment. Harold Muldrew's father was the first principal of Gravenhurst High School. He was, in fact, a brilliant botanist and had written a book about the plants and trees of Muskoka called Sylvan Ontario. It was the first book that had ever been written about the kinds of things that he was writing about plants in our area. He did a wonderful thing. He went out to the lake called Leg Lake at the time, and he dug up all kinds of trees and brought them back to Gravenhurst High School, and he planted an arboretum. And the students then had these trees to study. Leg Lake was renamed Muldrew Lake in his honor. He'd only been principal for a while when he was wooed away by what became the University of Guelph. It was, in fact, MacDonald College at the time, and he was hired to become a professor, if you like, at the early forerunner of University of Guelph. And he was only there for a year and a half when he died of diphtheria. Harold Muldrew was in Gravenhurst High School at the time when his father went to Guelph. So he just said, I'll stay here and finish my education with his sisters, and then we'll come and join you. Well, of course, his father dies. So Harold Muldrew takes his mother and two sisters, and they head out to Saskatchewan, sorry. And he becomes an elementary school teacher out there, and then signs up to become a soldier. In actual fact, he was killed running across no man's land carrying a Lewis gun. Lewis gun would not have been an easy thing to carry, awkward and heavy, and he was done. Hubert Corbett is another really interesting young man, only because, well, he comes from Malta for a starter. Everybody knows where Malta is? Malta? Yes, well, sort of, yeah. Yeah, down there. But that little red schoolhouse that's on that side. That's the Malta schoolhouse, okay? And that's in Morrison Township. So that's where he comes from. He's not really from Malta. That's where he lived. There was a little mill there at the time, and that's what he and his father did, was to work in that little mill. He got sick on the way over. He caught one of the childhood diseases. I think it was measles. A number of the men had never had measles and chickenpox. So we're in ships with, cheek by jowl and ships, and they're catching measles and chickenpox and all the things that we would just take for granted. Here they are, sick as dogs on the ship. So he gets sick, but he recovers. He gets on land in England. He gets sick, catches something else, gets sick. He's down again, recovers. Then he gets wounded and recovers. And finally, he's wounded really badly. He was shot in the head and could not recover from that. And in actual fact, at the ripe old age of 20, after all that he'd been through, he was dead. That's what Vimy Ridge looked like. Not the most prepossessing landscape for a battle, you might say. You can see the amount of water that was on the landscape. You can see how they had to sort of build themselves like little mud bridges and wood slat bridges across in order to get the wounded off the battlefield. You can also see up here a set of tracks. That would be probably light gauge railway that they used with wagons to move people to the battlefield, wounded from the battlefield, and all the artillery that they needed and so on. And you can see the artillery on the top right engaged in shooting, creating all of those great big holes in the landscape. And a whole group of men down here in a trench, some of them already wounded, some of them not. Most of them with a cigarette. And I love the picture in the center because, of course, those are the guys who survived, and they're on a couple of trucks, and they're ecstatic about the fact that they're still alive. This battle victory would ensure that Canadian soldiers would always be at the sharp end of the stick from then on. Nobody else had been able to take Vimy Ridge until the Canadians. The Canadians took it. They did it with dispatch, and they did it because they had General Sir Arthur Currie as their leader. And weren't we lucky? Yes.
Curry or Sir Julian Byng?
No, Currie. Currie was in charge. He took over from Byng.
Why, I thought Byng was the one that more or less planned the battle. And in effect conducted it properly so that they won it.
He would have liked to have taken full credit for that. I think that Sir Arthur Currie was the man who really epitomized what a general, a really good general was about. He's a man I really admire. He believed, he'd been a school teacher. That helps, I think, when you're trying to teach somebody something, you know, like troops or whatever, if you can figure out how to plan a lesson that everybody's going to get. So he had done that in his past. He actually been a real estate man too, so whatever that helps. Anyway, he believed that no man in the battle, in his unit, should go into battle without knowing exactly what should be happening. He had this this way of believing and making it happen, that everybody should be trained to know what the job of the guy in front of you is, and what he should know that job. He should know what is going to go on in this battle plan. They would rehearse the battles beforehand. They would actually go into a field behind, you know, the enemy lines when they were in R&R, and they would rehearse battles. They would plan it out to the nth degree as much as you possibly could. And he believed that if a man in front of you went down, you knew what his job was, and you would take over his job and yours. And then, if, you know, everybody would know where they were supposed to be going and what they should be doing. Absolutely, but as a team, well trained in everyone's job. Not too many chiefs, you know, a lot of guys who are going to, in fact, know the job and figure out what to do. Canadians were not known for a lot of reverence for their officers, might I mention. Their own officers more so than for British officers, whom they despised, absolutely despised, and with justification, I think. A lot of those British officers had received their commissions because of who they were, the money in their family. Many of them were not well educated at all. They were just people who had money and status, and they could buy a commission in the British Army. And so, in fact, who wants to follow that guy in battle? When, in fact, you might be able to follow somebody like, well, Julian Byng for one, and Arthur Currie for another, who maybe had some idea what ought to be going on. Did anybody say United States at this point yet? Because they haven't been in this at all up to this point until April of 1917. Why were they not in it? Well, let's just think about some of the reasons they might not be in it. For a starter, the same day that the British declared war, that was on the 4th of August, 1914, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, declared American neutrality. So he made it very clear, we're not having anything to do with this. The German Americans and Irish Americans, who made up a substantial portion of the American population, had no love for Britain. So right off the bat, you've got a group of people who aren't too interested in caring whether or not Britain does well in this war. Even though the Lusitania, which was a passenger ship, was actually torpedoed and sunk. In fact, there were only, I think, about 128 of the 1,200 people who were Americans on it. And so, in fact, that didn't have to propel them into the war either. They had a standing army of 100,000 people, but in actual fact, they were fighting a little bit of a battle with Mexico for some land that they were interested in owning. You can imagine where that would be done in Texas, California, and so in fact, they weren't really that interested in becoming involved in what was going on over there, when they in fact might get some land out of what they're doing with Mexico. Yeah, Pancho Villas was in fact, or Villas was actually a Mexican general. A very realistic thing to think about too is the amount of debt that was being incurred by countries in this war. Canada was not able to pay for the planes that they were having manufactured in the United States, nor were the British. I mean, the amount of money that it would cost to wage this war, the Americans were loaning money like crazy to the Canadians, the British, the Germans. The Americans were funding the Germans as well. That's a fascinating thing for a lot of people to sort of mull over, because where do your loyalties lie then if you've got debts from these people and debts from these people? But in actual fact, the British were more in debt than the Germans were to the Americans. So in fact, when you're going to decide which side you want to come in on so that they win and can pay you back, you're going to go in on the side of the British. So a number of things were done by the Germans really foolishly. They sent a telegram called the Zimmerman telegram that was sent to the Mexicans, telling them that if they would come into the war and start sabotaging, things from this side of the Atlantic over here, and they would come in on the German side, we'll make sure you get some of that land that the Americans were taking from you or trying to take from you. So you might want to join us. In fact, the Zimmerman telegram was intercepted, and so everybody kind of knew what had been going on. Enough was enough finally, and Woodrow Wilson did declare war on April the 6th, 1917 against Germany. Meanwhile, back at the ranch. Back home in Muskoka, the 122nd Battalion was still in the sort of recruitment and training stage. They had finished off in Muskoka. They were sent for the winter to Galt, Ontario, and there they were billeted. Actually, they had a camp here. And there they, not conscripted, sorry, wrong word. There they took on a number of other men from Hespeler, Preston, Galt, Kitchener, to fill in the ranks up to 1,000 men that had not been successfully recruited in the 122nd. So in fact, they literally were picking up men as they went down there. There was a crisis in Canada at this point as well. The 18th of May, 1917, Robert Borden finally had to do what he pledged to do, and that was institute conscription, compulsory military service. There just weren't enough men signing up anymore, because to get back to Richard's point of a while ago, people were starting to figure this out. Do I really want to go to war? Mom and dad are saying, don't you dare, because we're not going to get you back. So in actual fact, they were urging people then to quick join up now while you get a choice of where you want to go, who you want to be with, or apply for some kind of a, what should we say, an excuse for not to have to go at all. At the same time, May and July of 1917, we lost 3 more men. Frank Waite in West Gravenhurst, actually, I should have said they're not Gravenhurst. That's Frank Waite. His wife sitting below him there is Harriet Barnes, and those are his 3 children, just little mites, as you can see. And he joins up. He was a Bernardo boy, and so had come to our country with his brother when he was quite young, and he was killed in battle. Roy Henley, also killed on the 26th of July, 1917, and Charles Anthony Macaulay on the 31st of July, 1917. All of these men continuing to fall while we still have the 122nd in Canada. Everyone had an opinion on conscription, by the way, as you can only imagine. And in fact, not everybody was wildly in favor of it. But for the most part, the people who had relatives in the war certainly were. By August of 1917, we're looking at a battle called Hill 70. Again, not a lot of a hill, but a hill nonetheless, and a hill that had not been able to be taken by anybody until the Canadians got there. And General Currie, Sir Arthur Currie, was in charge completely of this operation. He had been involved in the militia actually in his past, so he certainly knew something about soldiering, and he was a smart man. So he drew up the battle plans for Hill 70. He got everybody rehearsed, And when the time came for battle, they knew that Hill 70 was going to be really difficult. I mean, the Germans are up on the top of Hill 70 and the Canadians are down at the bottom. Not made for a happy battle for sure. But in actual fact, eventually the Canadians managed to take the hill, but they took it at quite a cost. Among others, all of these boys are ours. So Albert Rennie, who's actually a relative of Mrs. Forsyth, was 21 years old when killed at Hill 70. Harrison Vernon was 29. Cyril Power Palmer, whose father was actually a reeve of, I believe, Muskoka Township, was 21. Corporal Robert Earl Gammon was from Severn Bridge. He was 25. And Harry Charles Burnett came from Ryde and he was 24. Doesn't he look like the youngest boy you've? I mean, he's 24. He still looks to me like he might be about 14 or 15 years old. He has such an innocent little face. He's actually married and living in London, Ontario at the time when he signed up. Hard to believe. And then came Passchendaele. Well, not the worst battle that our men fought, but certainly one of them. He again really set about preparing everything, knowing, of course, that it was not the landscape in which you really want to fight. He had to take both the village and that ridge, Passchendaele Ridge, which was there by crossing a plateau and then taking that ridge. He would lose almost exactly the number of men that he had predicted he would lose. I mean, that's how much of a general he was. He was told he had to do this, that he had to do Passchendaele. He did not want to because he thought he would lose X number of men. In fact, 4,000 Canadians killed and 12,000 wounded. That's what he told the people above him. And nonetheless, he was ordered to do it anyway. And they did it and they took it. But in fact, it was a terrible victory, I guess you could say, for them. And it certainly secured the image of Canadians as being the guys you wanted anytime the going got rough and tough. Yeah.
I mean, the Germans retook it a short time later.
They did, and then the Canadians retook again. Yeah, I called Passchendaele mud and madness. I mean, that's really, if you look at that mess that's there, that's what it looked like to fight in Passchendaele. It's all that water, all those craters, men drowned in them. Men would literally be walking along and would simply disappear. And then when you got to the end of the day and you had to account for your men, where is everybody? Last I saw of him was, I mean, you see that in a number of the records. The last I saw of him, or the last he was seen walking across the battlefield and he disappeared. Well, that's how.
There's been a movie recently made called Passchendaele.
There was.
A reenactment, and
There was,
and
and
it gives a pretty graphic picture of what that was like.
it does, absolutely. I asked my son about what he felt about it, whether he felt it was accurate or not, because he's an expert in the field. And he said pretty accurate. Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of stuff dramatized, but in fact, yeah, it was pretty accurate. And as I say, Currie didn't want to do this. He did not want this battle to take place, but he had to do it. He was ordered to do it. We're now at the end of 1917, still talking about Passchendaele, and some more men lost. Roy Urquhart, Jack Greenwood, who's the young man that Bertie Robinson had hoped to marry, Walter Perkins, William Robert Wilson. Walter Perkins, by the way, was part of a musical family in Gravenhurst that had been here for quite a long time. His father and even I think his grandfather were musicians in the local band. And Walter was as well. As you can see, he's holding a trumpet, which would have been just before he went overseas. He didn't join the 122nd of the band going over. He joined another unit entirely. William Robert Wilson, 32, a little older. And then James Alexander Frizzle from Severn Bridge, 29 years old. Again, I'm always amazed, by the way, at how many pictures I've been able to find of these men. You sort of you appeal to every family you possibly can on what am I trying to say? The ancestry.ca. You find his records and then you see who's in charge of a family tree and ask them if they've got anything. And occasionally you do come up with something. If in fact conscription had already been laid on, in fact, it hadn't really been enforced until January of 1918. And that's partially because out of the 400,000 Canadian men who would receive conscription notices, 380,500 applied for exemptions. Oh, absolutely. And you could just about plead anything, you know, and for a little while it worked and they were able to be exempt. I'm a farmer's son, we're growing the vegetables to feed the country and blah, blah. But with the collapse of the Russian front in 1917, the need for soldiers was just phenomenal at this point. The Germans had been able to pull all of their people on the Eastern Front, that Russian front, all over to the Western Front. And now you've got that massive group of soldiers who have come in on the German side, and they moved them directly to the Western Front. They were going to smash through the British defenses and head for the sea. So they were going to head for the sea and maybe head for England if they could, you know. So I mean, getting to the sea would be the first step. Borden had to eventually just simply cancel the exemptions and say, I'm sorry, but you've got to go. We've got to have a whole lot of men, and we promise that we will. The last 100 days. Despite the fact that it was early 1918, we can only call this period the beginning of the year, because in fact, it's just the beginning of getting to the end of this war. So all of these things are happening all at once here. The Canadians are advancing. They're being more and more successful in that last 100 days. We lose a number of soldiers along the way here. For instance, we lost Arthur Edward Doxey and William James Taylor. We lost Gordon McKean, who is a relative of Frank Miller. His mother and Frank Miller's mother were sisters. And George Henry Lush, we lost as well. All of these young men lost in that last 100-day period. He would lead his Canadian divisions at the sharp end of every attack that came along after that. They broke through the Drocourt-Quéant line in early September. They got across Canal du Nord and headed to take Bourlon Wood on the 27th of September, and they went on to capture the town of Cambrai. My husband's grandfather was shot at Bourlon Wood. The man who was standing beside him, who was actually a friend of his from Eastern Ontario, from the Renfrew area, put his head up above the parapet because nobody had been shooting for a few minutes. So he kind of wants to see what's going on. And I guess Hal's grandfather grabbed him by the arm to pull him down, but it was too late. He was shot right in the forehead and killed. And so as he was pulling him down, Hal's grandfather was shot as well. But luckily not so badly wounded. He lost the use of one arm, but was sent to Blighty. We lost William George Hedger, Roy Elwood Hawkins at Cambrai, and we lost Archie Allen MacDonald, who came from Ryde, also at Cambrai. Eventually, we will see the vilification of Currie, and that breaks my heart because I have to tell you that I admire him tremendously. I think I've said it already. He was ordered to take the town, I guess it was a town, not a village, of Mons at the very, very, very end of the war. He was ordered from on high, even though he said, don't we all know that the end is near? Here it's nigh, we're going to be ending this war. Why do I have to risk my men and take that village? I'll tell you why he had to. They'd lost a battle in Mons in the very first weeks of the First World War, the British had, and they were absolutely horrified that they'd lost that battle. They lost this village of Mons. So it was for them a really major thing to take that village because they lost it to the Germans. Now they were going to take it back and they were going to send the Canadians in to do it because they would be able to get it. And so in fact, they took most, and the last man killed in the Great War was killed just before armistice was declared. And in fact, he wore the can for that. He was vilified, I say there. These men here, you begin to see quite a difference. These men are not dying in battle. These men are now dying of disease. Anybody working in the Forestry Corps in the 122nd, and very few of them died, but Corporal William A. Richardson is one who did. He was in the Forestry Corps. They tended to be wet a lot of the time. They were working in the rain, and so as a result, they would get pneumonia. Robert James Lowshaw was wounded and then sent to Kinmel Park to sort of recuperate, which was a holding camp for soldiers heading back to Canada, and he died there of pneumonia. And Sergeant Neil Stewart McCallum died in another holding camp of pneumonia. What a waste of life. All these guys sent to a holding camp to be sent home, and they end up dead. Mhm.
I remember reading that in the First World War, it was still the case that as many troops died of disease, died, in battle or from wounds, and yet I don't think any of the soldiers you're listing here are listed as having died from disease. Did you find very many that were?
Yeah, I have numbers on it for all of the communities that sent soldiers over from our area.
Any Gravenhurst boys died
Oh
of
yeah,
disease?
absolutely. We're going to meet a couple in a minute. Well, those three boys there all died of disease that we just talked about.
Also, I had the impression that Curry actually wanted to capture Mons. That in effect he thought, well, we want to pay the Germans back, for this defeat and earlier on. And
It was a British defeat, not a Canadian
granted,
defeat.
but I could be wrong, of course.
I don't think so. Anything that I've read, including a biography of him, suggests that he very much did not want to risk his men on the last day of the war. It just was not, he felt, a thing to do. He was vilified by the Coburg press. He had lived in Coburg, and that was kind of his newspaper at the time. He was raised in Strathroy and lived out in BC for a while. But in fact, Coburg would have been like his town newspaper. And they actually took him on and said, you caused unnecessary death by taking Mons. He took the newspaper to trial for defamation and libel because the soldiers in his unit said, this isn't true. He's not like that. He did not cause deaths. He had to do what he had to do. They knew what he'd been given as an order. The courts decided the case in his favor, but it took a year and a half to get it decided. And by the time it was, he was a broken man. He did get named Chancellor of McGill University, but his heart was really broken by the fact that the Canadians would treat him in that way after what he had tried to do for the men. And he didn't last very long after the war. It was an end to the fighting, but not an end to the dying. The Canadians would end up doing occupation work. They would have to wait for repatriation. The guys who were working in the forests cutting trees, they were still in the forest cutting trees because the trees were still needed, the wood was still needed. So in fact, they were very busy still doing that. There were demobilization camps set up in England so that you brought all these soldiers together from Europe and then sent them over to England, only to discover that you didn't have enough ships to send them home on. The ship had to take that journey all the way to Canada. It then had to be refitted. Then it had to take a journey all the way back to England, be refitted. And then it had to pick up the soldiers. It was just a nightmare trying to repatriate all of those soldiers. And the Canadian ports couldn't handle the volume. There were striking dock workers in England. It just went on and on and on. And the guys in the demobilization camps were literally cheek by jowl in there. It was just disease everywhere. And at one point in Kinmel Park, there was a riot. So simply rioted and turned on the, shall we say, jailers, captors, and said, we're not staying in here, because they wouldn't let them out of the camp. They wouldn't let them go to town. They wouldn't let them go anywhere. And they had nothing to do. These are soldiers who've been just fighting or cutting trees or doing whatever they, now they're standing around, cheek by jowl, getting sick and dying.
The epidemic in 1919.
Was coming, yeah, absolutely. My son wrote a book about the Spanish influenza epidemic of 1919, and it was already impacting soldiers, no question about it. The soldiers had enlisted for the duration of the war in 6 months. I don't know if they'd read their attestation papers very carefully when they did the signing up, but in actual fact, they were really not supposed to expect to be home before June of 1919. And they were home by June of 1919. They were repatriated, but that's not what they understood. They thought the war is over. I'm going home now, right? I mean, that's just what they believed. Forestry Corps had to clean up the land and have an inspection to make sure it was as clean and pristine as the French wanted it to be. Yeah, oh, yeah, politics everywhere. There's one of our boys that we lost to pneumonia. Another one, Gordon McKinley Flowers, 3 Flowers Inn for people who've been around our area long enough, or Tom Robinson's Robinson House, which is what it was before 3 Flowers Inn. It's roughly about where the Fire College is now, or slightly between the Fire College and the Muskoka Center. That's where it was. And his family, the Flowers family, ran the 3 Flowers Inn. Louis Lemire is buried here. William John Cook of Morrison Township was the other really, really sad, horrible irony, I think. He was the second guy I named as the second soldier to sign up from here in the First World War. He ended up living through and surviving the entire First World War. He was at the front. He wasn't in the 122nd cutting trees. He was at the front. He was a railway man, building and rebuilding the tracks that would take the men into the battlefield and take the wounded out, take the armaments into the battlefield and so on. They were constantly blowing up these little tramways or railways, like big railways, and he was constantly rebuilding them. So he was right where all the shelling was taking place, and he ended up dying in a repatriation camp. How could any family deal with that? That, by the way, up in the top there, that's Gordon McKinley Flowers waving with his finger in the air to his mother. He's waving, and his mother is over on the very far right side of the photograph, and the right up there. She's waving a white handkerchief. She's got a dark colored hat and a white blouse, and that's his mom waving goodbye to him, the last she would ever see him. From 1919 to 1922, the dying didn't stop. 1922, however, was the cutoff year by which you could then say, in March of 1922, a man was officially killed in action. Anybody who died as a result of his war wounds or sickness or whatever, after that time, is not in the Book of Remembrance in the Parliament buildings. He is not considered to have been proven to die in action. So these are the last men from our area who are proven and can be put on a monument and so on, as soldiers who died in action. And inaction is killed in action means killed in battle, died of disease is DOD, and died of wounds is DOW. So providing you died by the end of March 1922, you would in fact be considered to be a soldier killed in action. And there's 4 guys right there. And you can see they've all died of disease. So they've died in Kinmel Park of influenza. They've died of hemoptysis, which is a blood disease caused by infection at home. Edwin Carleton Martyr of the Martyr family, but not the son of either of the 2 martyrs that we would maybe be familiar with. He's a cousin, but he dies from poison gas inhalation in Saskatchewan. And George Henderson, ironically, who had worked at the tuberculosis-free hospital in Gravenhurst, died in that hospital of tuberculosis. contracted in the war. And if you lost someone in the war, what were you left with? A dead man's penny, which was that big round penny that was sent to the families of any soldier killed in action. Many of them actually threw them out, buried them, threw them into an outhouse, and said, what the heck do you take me for? That I would think that that would be something that I would want to value in the place of my husband, my son, my whatever. He's worth a penny. The medal in the middle is the mother's medal that was awarded to moms of young men who were killed. And the two medals on the right, and that, by the way, is George Henderson. Those two medals are the medals that were awarded to every soldier who fought in the First World War. Unless it was it wasn't an easy thing to repatriate all these people. I'm not going to continue on here any longer, only to say there are the numbers. And what we sent over there, basically, well, we sent over 587 men from Gravenhurst, West Gravenhurst, Morrison, Muskoka, and Ryde. When you think of the population of our area, and when you think that out of those population numbers, we're looking at a population number that represents men, women, and children, and then get to the point where you're talking about men between the ages of 18 and 45, which, you know, cuts that men population again. And then we send 587 of them. 26 names of the fallen are on our monument, but 3 of them didn't die in war. Some names were added at various times along the way. The women of the town who actually got the monument built when the town council couldn't get it done, the women did it, and they had 15 names of soldiers on there, 16 names of soldiers, and they were all killed. And then in 1970, when they took down the memorial pillars and built the memorial wall that we probably all remember between the Opera House and Carnegie Library, using the stone from those big pillars, suddenly names were added to the monument from some amorphous site. I have no idea where they got them from. Because there we got 3 men who didn't even die in the war, and we got 4 men from the Muskoka Sanatorium who weren't from Gravenhurst at all, but were buried here because they couldn't find their families, and suddenly they're added as being our guys. I wouldn't want them taken off. And then we're missing 44 names of men in action or whatever. Our town hasn't seemingly had the will to do anything about that yet, but I'm about to go on the warpath. There's, yeah, be prepared. Everybody get a vest. War is about to be declared in Gravenhurst. The men whose names are in bold are the men who are not on the memorial. The men whose names are not bolded are the men who are there. I've taken the 3 names out. You can see a space over here and a space over there. I took the 3 names out of the men who didn't die in battle, and there are 44 new names, plus the 4 men from Muskoka Sanatorium at that bottom row, Burnett, Middleton, Pike, and Stratton, who have nothing to do with Gravenhurst. But why would we take them off our memorial? I mean, they have to be memorialized somewhere, and they couldn't find their families, so we would never take them off. You know.
They enlisted? Did they serve?
Oh yeah, absolutely. They served and contracted tuberculosis and got sent to the sand. Yeah. So they deserve to be remembered, and we're the keepers of their history. Questions? It's a bit full of info, I know. And boy, did I go overtime. Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry. Apologies. But it's hard to sort of rein me in once I get going, isn't it?
Very worthy cause you take up, Judy, in order
Yeah.
to try to track down and get personalities and so on. Wow.
Well, I couldn't stand going to Remembrance Day and being there and not knowing who these people were whose names I heard every Remembrance Day. I'd stand there and I'd listen. My father was in the Second World War, so I have a bit of a, I guess a thing there, but I just couldn't stand the fact that I didn't know who they were, didn't know what they did, didn't know why they were on the monument. knew nothing about them, and it really bothered me. And I was just retiring from my job. So boy, oh boy, talk about suddenly thinking to myself, this might be something I'm not like to do. Anyway. I hope we have good weather on Remembrance Day and that we can all go and share in the stories of these men. The official monument is the one at the Opera House. The what I like to call the granite, thanks, the granite countertops.
The Legion still recognizes that even though we have their own.
They have something with no names on it though. Yeah.
Yes.
So in fact, and the Legion and the town parted company over. Mhm. Yeah, there was a lot of rancor about how things were done with monuments and so on in lots of towns, but particularly here. And the Legion didn't feel like they'd been consulted. They didn't feel like they had a part in it. The town kind of